So we're moving to the conversation now. And a question that we wish to explore is, where are we in terms of these developments in schools with attempts at interdisciplinarity, Aboriginal perspectives, and other attempts at creating spaces by which Aboriginal knowledge can be brought to the fore more than it has? Are we getting there? Are we achieving the sort of transformational change that needs to occur? Or what are the impediments and how might we move to new possibilities? So let me open it up there. Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up for everybody?
Thanks, Rob. I think this is a really critical issue. And, we know from some really serious science in Australia that particularly in Australia, many students are consistently disengaged in class, and as much as around about 40% are unproductive in any given year. And so when those numbers are quite stark when you talk about Aboriginal kids, but we're seeing all children being disengaged from public school systems. The numeracy and literacy rates are going backwards. Aboriginal rates haven't moved over the last decade, despite 10 years of investment in standardised testing. So we simply haven't, more of the same is not an option. So the key question then is, where do we put our energies? Do we invest it in more curriculum? Do we invest it in greater funding? Do we have a far more investment in trying to overcome the national policy failure? Do we look at pedagogy? Do we look at school's purpose? Ask the question again, what is the purpose of schooling in a settler society, Anglophone country like Australia? All of these point to possible futures of a new world education that would be benefiting all children in Australia. I want to focus particularly on Indigenous children and provocate the argument and put a sort of a new world education section forward and a solution forward. And that is, I think pedagogy is the answer. I've spent most of my career in policy studies, trying to make policy more responsive. I spent lots of time on curriculum and trying to make curriculum more responsive. Towards the twilight of my career, I think pedagogy is the solution. At the end of the day, no matter what the curriculum is, you need a good quality teacher to teach it. So I'm sort of asking questions like, okay, if all children are intelligent and all children bring their cultural capital to school, and yet the teacher's pedagogy is only buying a certain capital from a very minor group inside the classroom, and leaving all of this other cultural capital through diversity on the classroom floor, how do we deal with this? And so I've just sort of penciled a paper called Aboriginal Child as Knowledge Producer. The Aboriginal child has always produced knowledge, and has always been intelligent, and has always brought their cultural and linguistic capital to school, not to have it recognised. So I think if we repurpose pedagogy to be able to capture those, and my research is talking about 4 ways of how a teacher's practice validates, affirms, builds, and bridges the school, the local intelligences that the community children are bringing to school. So I'm thinking, I'm wanting the teacher to ask the questions about what are the inquiry questions that Aboriginal children ask? How do local Aboriginal children produce knowledge? And how can I connect the curriculum content to these intelligences that the child is bringing to school? So how do our teaching practices cultivate greater student engagement for stronger transition from preschool to primary, from primary to secondary, from secondary to university, and so on? So I think that this cultivation, it must be more than just the accumulation of whiteness. It must be more. Schools must be more than just the accumulation of settler grammar. For Aboriginal children who've been producing Aboriginal knowledges for generations that protect country, protect kinships, protect their language, it's surely the purpose of schooling and the teacher practices have to be more than just settler grammar.
I'm just not sure teachers have enough knowledge of Aboriginal issues, of Aboriginal matters. And so I'm interested in Tammy's discussion of what it's like to actually be dealing in schools where the predominantly you've got basically white settler teachers who aren't necessarily connected with communities.
Yeah, I certainly concur with Brother Lester on the pedagogy. What teachers do in their everyday practice is what matters. What we as a system don't ever get away from is what the curriculum tells us to do. And I see it as a big challenge, particularly for very early career and later career teachers who are from that white worldview. For us, it has been about really unteaching them. And I'm conscious that can't happen in every school. I challenge why it can't. I suppose it's around the constructs of schools and the structures of schools and the expectations of what school teachers are supposed to look like that needs to probably be challenged a lot. And I feel like teachers who get into this space, this career, are people who are mostly, I've really encountered anyone who is not committed to bringing about change for Aboriginal kids. I just wonder how much our structure and our system impedes them being able to do that. And so we do a lot of work in teaching teachers the way that we need them to behave, how we need them to talk and look and think, because the way that they come to us doesn't work for our kids initially. So it's a lot of work in teacher education once they're in the space that we kind of undertake to support that.
Rob, do you want to talk about?
Rob, sorry, James. I just want to.
I was going to say, do you want to talk about Menindee?
I do want to talk about Menindee, and I want to talk in particular about one particular new teacher, just to not even challenge, but build upon this perception that that white settler teachers need to have the knowledge that's embedded in Aboriginal experiences to be effective. And one of the things that a new teacher in Menindee, who just happens to have a PhD and taught in schools, taught in universities in France a couple of years ago, and then decided he wanted to do more. So I've taken on the role of sort of mentoring this guy out at Menindee, and I'm fascinated by the types of, I guess, notes that he's produced around his experience. I advised him to keep a journal of his teaching experience, the experience of living in the community, whatever. And some of the things that he's producing is fascinating, particularly around the concept of what he refers to as emergent discourses. And by this, he starts his day and with the kids in the classroom, and he gets them to identify what is on their mind. What are they concerned about? What are the type of things that they bring to the school that, as a teacher, he needs to be aware of? So he spends, most of the time that he's engaged with his kids, having this type of discourse, this type of conversation. And I find that to be quite exciting and liberating, both for the teacher, but also for the student. So I think one of the things I'd also add is I believe that, yes, we've always been knowledge keepers and knowledge producers since time immemorial. I think obviously what's missing in the schools that we now have our kids engaged with is that there's a lack of parents. There's a lack of community knowledge holders in the education process. And that's what I mean by the guest paradigm, that these kids are just simply guests in the Western domain. And every now and again, we might open up doors to allow some of the parents and some of the communities and some of the knowledge keepers to come in and share. And I believe that's one of the fundamental flaws, as well as the corporatization of education. I think that that's one of the fundamental flaws, the alignment with neoliberalism and the type of things that are happening in the broader society, and how that impacts the journey of knowledge that our kids and all kids are experiencing in schools. I fear that we become too aligned with neoliberalism and the teachings around neoliberalism in a 21st century world. And I'm not sure that that will benefit anyone over time.
Might jump in on a couple topics, if that's okay. I'm trying to figure out where to start. I'll pick up, I think, with Lester's observation about the degree to which that if what you try to do is change behavior by developing a new curriculum document, that you're probably engaged in folly. And I say that, by the way, as Peter Peabody may not know this, but that sustainability cross-curriculum statement was generated by myself and 2 other people. So I know it well.
I did know that, actually.
What's that?
I did know that. So I was hoping you'd
Okay.
accept the invitation to walk in.
Right. Okay. But one of the things that's crucial about it, as Tammy pointed out, is when it comes to the teachers will do what they're told to do at the end of the day. And the cross-curriculum statements are written as superfluous, right? So the examples you get on the formal documents are, oh, this is how you fit it into history. This is how you fit it into, right? And so when you look at the legislation, it's the actual KLAs that are in the legislation, right? So let's be very clear. The document is a hand-waving gesture at best. But the thinking behind, and there's a couple of things to keep in mind. I spent a long time trying to figure out how you get school systems to shift. One of the things we definitely do lack is any kind of exemplars of really great success. Right? In part because it's very difficult to get any kind of anything radically different happening in schools now in the current context, unless somebody gives them free rein and says, okay, try to go a different way. It's just simply not going to happen. All right. So anyway, in that regard, there's a couple ideas I just want to toss out. Lessons that we learned from the new basics. I don't know how much of that Peter can fill in the background of the new basics, but there were 3. I chaired the evaluation on the new basics, and the cut and dried results of the new basics. I think a lot of people have not heard. And for background, the new basics was this trial that was put together up in Queensland about a decade and a half ago, where schools, we had made an observation and research on the kind of the paucity and the anemic nature of the pedagogical experience of students. The system turned around and said, hey, what are you going to do about it? And then, they gave Alan the keys, that's Alan Luke, to design an alternative. And we began that with the observation that the main thing you have to worry about are actually threefold, not just one. You can't just go in and try to change pedagogy without changing the curriculum. Changing the curriculum on itself doesn't do anything, and they're all beholden to the assessment. So you've got to work with all 3 quote unquote message systems. The curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment need radically kind of reconfigured if you're going to get any change. Now, in a set of 50 schools where that was done, and they were given new categories of curriculum, they're made up, right? They were given an assessment system that was based on rich tasks. They were given a pedagogical model that was based on the first years of data of a project that didn't report outcomes before they adopted the pedagogical model. So you had whole categories of new ways of going about things, and total kind of up to the school and determining the logistics, how they're going to organize things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it took 3 years to get some serious change. At the end of the day, there was some significant change, and we had in the evaluation, we had 3 main questions. The first being, did we get the outcomes we were looking for? And that was, we were looking for improvements in students producing quote unquote new basics, 21st century ways of knowing, et cetera, without any great loss in the old basics. And the answer to that was yes, they did succeed that. The second evaluation question was, did it have stakeholder buy-in? Now, if we had asked that at the end of the first year, the answer would have been, everybody except the teachers. But by the end of the 3rd year, everybody was supportive of it. And the last question was, could the system do it? And the answer on that was a flat no. And the reason the system couldn't do it had to do with a range of issues, anywhere from the internal politics of people in central offices white-handing the whole thing, all the way through to capacity of systems to support teachers to think differently about what they do, through to the amount of time it takes for teachers to generate curriculum in a new way, based on knowledge they don't currently have. So, I mean, one of the main things that, one of the many things that have happened out in India that has kind of led to the situation where we had this guy landing there, doing things differently. Over the time period we've been there, things have changed quite a lot. But one of the first things that happens now is all first-year teachers go out and get an on-country experience from the local mobs, local families. One of the first things they're told is you've got to meet the families, come out and meet the right face to face. And so the idea that teachers don't have knowledge is absolutely obvious in places like that, but you've got to also remember that's true in every school. The basic structures of school are designed in a manner where the assumption is that you have a teacher, not a human being, a teacher. So the best way I can illustrate this is through a conversation with one of the parents out of Menindee, who in the first year, there was this kindergarten teacher who had a blind Arab year, brilliant year. And in the second year, the number of kids coming into kindergarten doubled. Right? Now this is a town of 300. So they had this explosion of families bringing their kids into the school where they hadn't been before. And, you know, I kind of knew what was going on. I'd been there watching and seeing it, but I asked one of the parents, you know, why this was going on. And, you know, she explained that the teacher, when she first got there, she had gone out and met all the families, that she knew who they were. She had brought parents into the classroom so the parents felt comfortable, et cetera. And I said, yeah, sure. But, you know, why all the new people? And she says, James, who in their right mind would send their most precious part of their life to somebody they don't know? And the answer is almost all white folk do that every time they send their kid to kindergarten, right? We've got systems that are based on roles, not humans. We've got a curriculum that is not based on finding out what kids are good at, what they're interested in, right? We've got a curriculum based on the idea that there's a group of big, you know, kind of big authorities telling everybody what they're going to learn, and we're going to measure kids against what they don't have, not what they can do. I did a study with some of our interview data, asking teachers, trying to figure out what the conception of ability was that teachers were using. And it came up because we had a question that didn't say anything about that. It asked how they modified their curriculum and their how they modified their pedagogy for the whatever range of kids they had. And, you know, you had the fairly typical stuff about differentiating, et cetera. But every single teacher out of 300 used the notion of ability. So I went back to figure out what they meant by the notion of ability. And there were some basic ideas that we know are problematic. One is that there is this notion of ability that is some kind of single rank, that's going to be tied to a physical body that's encompassed by skin, and that it's static. That was the assumption. But the most interesting bit was the notion of ability was not used by these teachers to talk about what kids can do. The notion of ability was to use to say what kids cannot do. So it was used as a way of talking about what kids won't get, not what they will get, or what they will do, or what they could do. So, you know, given the nature of the institution, it shouldn't surprise anybody that a culture that does not conform to the absolute narrow conception of what's acceptable is absent.
I think it does come back to Biesta's notion of publicness. You know, what is the purpose of public schooling? All Aboriginal children are enrolled in public schooling. So there has to be a key question of if public schools are there for the public good, that they're secular and that they're free, these are the bedrock principles of publicness, then we need to be looking at that these ideas affect schools and these affect the children that are coming into it. So there are new belongings of publics. And I think that schools have not kept up to pace and teachers' pedagogy of the super diverse learner that's walking into class. And I think that we need a provocation that helps us rethink the public education corrosion, both internally and externally. And I think that a part of its corrosion is the focus on high stakes testing and the funding story. But I want to come back to this major point that public education delivered to Aboriginal children has not lived up to the promise of democracy. It has not captured the epistemological and ontological ideas that Indigenous linguistic and cultural repertoire that these children are bringing these examples to class. And that the Australian public school system, we have to have a debate on how it achieves equity and fairness for all of its children, not just for a small sum of them.
Yeah, I also think that part of the problem is a unidimensional view of diversity almost, and how part of the issue, and I think James has brought this up, is they want to view ability as not being socioculturally bound in a way that's dynamic and changeable and varies from across spaces. I'm really struck by the fact that when I talk to some of my colleagues at universities, their view of university's role is to shape people in their image rather than to help people develop organically in diverse sorts of ways.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to my main point that I don't think we've put front and centre that Indigenous knowings exist in their own right and that they're real and that we all function from within what I term the brick wall or Western knowledge. We tend to think within that space. So when we're in a classroom teaching, we're developing curriculum. When we're philosophizing this, we're within the brick wall trying to add a few Aboriginal perspectives. Whereas if we can go into that space in between, which is what I think is happening at Menindee, you see people who have taken themselves out of that brick wall to a certain extent, and they are playing and working with different concepts. They are not trying to fit it into epistemologies and ontologies. They're trying to fit it into something else. And I want to illustrate this with some work that I've been doing at NAISDA, which is the National Aboriginal Islander Dance College. So the NAISDA offers certificates, advanced diplomas, a range of courses at that level. And it's all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. They call them performing artists and developing artists. And the curriculum is curriculum that's prescribed through compliance. Now, for most of the time, it's that compliance. We're in the brick wall and we're actually trying to develop the curriculum for this unique dance college, but we're doing it within the compliance mechanism. I chair the Board of Studies at NAISTA, and I've worked with the staff and students, or DAs and PAs there, to actually jump into that space in between and say, what can this look like? Now, this requires a hell of a lot of vulnerability, because you have practitioners, trainers, teachers who believe they have a lot of knowledge, which they do have. Some are afraid of doing things in the Aboriginal space for fear of making wrong decisions or doing the wrong thing. Others are just unsure and don't see the relevance of it. So this is happening within this space as an Aboriginal college. But by taking it into a different space and saying to people, all right, yes, we have to look at compliance, but let's start somewhere else first. Let's start with Indigenous knowings, and particularly at a performing arts college where dance is such an expression of Indigenous knowings, that's the basis, that's the currency that we use to then develop the rest of the curriculum. And it's been, I've seen teachers, trainers go from being in a quagmire, in a marsh, just unable to move. They're not really wanting to. They love what they do. They love what they teach. And they will say to me, oh, we're adding Aboriginal perspectives. We're doing that. And they really believe they do. You know, when someone teaching music says, oh, we're teaching jazz, and that's an Aboriginal perspective, because it's something that's bringing in the impromptu. And it's a misunderstanding of how to work with Indigenous knowings. And again, unless we put at the front and centre that notion that Indigenous knowings are different, they are not something that can just be fitted into Western knowledge, I don't see us developing that bundle of possibilities to make for real change.
Can I ask Ned, you and Tammy particularly, whether you think the cross-curriculum priority for Indigenous perspectives could be a vehicle for delivering these kinds of outcomes, that sort of notion of distinctiveness, and how that might be used, you know, to develop more broadly across the system, not just in schools with high proportion of Aboriginal kids. I'm thinking of non-Aboriginal kids getting to learn these things, getting to learn this notion of the distinctiveness of ways of knowing. Is this a vehicle that, or is it just a wrong model, do you think? I mean, how do you see it acting out?
Yeah, I think, and Ned might have differing views, but I think it's probably not the space. I think the cross-curricular priorities lends themselves to some kind of mostly fundamental, and I might have it really wrong, but kind of cultural knowledges. But in terms of the way that we practice, the way, you know, our pedagogies are, I don't think that would be the space that you could do it. I don't know what you think, Ned, on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. No, I agree with you. But I would perhaps comment differently. I think they are basically a thread in the bundle of possibilities. And it's that notion that we can't have one right answer to all of this. We have to look at differences. Now, the curriculum at the moment has been developed in a time and space where we're not really informed properly from my perspective about Indigenous knowings. That's not to say that every minute of every day, new things are being developed, whether it's at Briar Road, Tammy, or whether it's in Menindee. Those sorts of things are being developed and need to come into the space that we're using. But if we fall into that trap of there being a right answer to the question, which is firmly embedded in that brick wall, then we won't move forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Ned. I think for us, we're in a scary space at the moment in terms of teacher and teacher quality, that we're seeing, I suppose, almost a stepping back to being content deliverers in New South Wales. That really worries me, because I think that we worked pretty hard to move away from that for a period of time. And I feel like we're stepping back somewhat, and it is the demands of the system, it's the demands of governments that we're seeing kind of create this somewhat scary space. I get really interested, and I've not done a great deal of research in this space, and everyone in this panel today knows way more about this than me. But when I look at brothers and sisters like Fiona Kelly out at Menindee and you know, Nathan Towney at Newcastle, and we share and connect a lot as Aboriginal leaders in education, I wonder if it's our Indigenous ways and knowledges that make us do what we do in our work. I do truly believe that that's what it is. And when I have colleagues say, "Oh, you know, it's easy for you, Tammy," I challenge that it's not just easy for me. That if my colleagues were brave enough or braver, because some of them are brave enough, but some of them were braver kind of to step in that space and really assess the lenses that they use in their leadership and in their work, whether they could create, you know, more of a space in their school where people would be more inclined to look at things from a different viewpoint. I think still, though, we've done a lot of work on it, but there's still a big space to go. And I know Uncle Bob challenged me on this a couple of weeks ago. He said, you know, what's the impediment to your work? And Ned, you picked up on it, but the impediment was the challenge of the curriculum and how to move in that and within that, and in order to still get the work done that we know as Aboriginal leaders we need to get done, but also fulfill the requirements of the system. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I see for schools overall. And I think that Aboriginal leaders in schools, I suppose it's that moral purpose that we have, that cultural purpose that we have, that drives us a little bit differently in our work in schools.
Yeah, and Tammy, I think picking up on that, it is hard for us as Aboriginal people engaging in the space because we've come through the system. We may have our cultural knowledges and integrity or knowings, but we have all come through the system too. And it's really important. I know this term gets bandied around a lot, but it's really important for us to decolonize our thinking, our practices, our processes, as much as it is non-Aboriginal practitioners in this space too, and creating new languages, creating new processes. And that's what I see as really exciting. That for me is that messy space in between, you know, and it requires us to be extremely vulnerable. It requires an awful lot of energy, but it really can be transformative when you start creating that bundle of possibilities.
Absolutely. I think the storming part of anything is the best.
Can I just pick up on Peter's point that was asking Nerida on the cross-curriculum priorities? Let's just look at the evidence for a moment. So we've had the most the country has ever invested into standardised testing. And over 10 years, Aboriginal movement on Aboriginal educational outcomes have gone backwards. We've had cross-curriculum priorities for a while now, and the numbers haven't moved. We've had more than any time in Australia's history, more complex curriculum added to the national curriculum about Aboriginal understandings, Aboriginal perspectives, and we're still going backwards. So the key question is, how do we explain this inequality? And the second key question is, more of the same surely should not be an option. We've had 10 years at this. So making the curriculum, it would seem to me, making the curriculum more complex with more content, and then expecting a non-Indigenous Anglophone teacher to teach it, could create far more complexity to the system for Aboriginal children than a simplicity. So if we're looking at evidence-based educational futures for Aboriginal children, then the evidence would clearly describe that a more complex curriculum may not be the answer, and a shift from a belonging understanding away from just framing success, really, schooling success by, the expertise in settler grammar. So that it would seem to me that to use Professor Ladwig's argument around crises, that we've got to come back with what are the knowledges, the linguistic strengths, the cultural strengths that each child, Aboriginal, Muslim, women, disabled, digital people, students who have digital skills, those that don't. What are the cultural capital that these students are bringing to class, and how do I link that to the curriculum? And it would seem to me that that's the pedagogy that I'm talking about, that the pedagogical skills. I'm wanting to hear a far more, sophisticated argument for a more complex curriculum for a non-Indigenous teacher to develop, and then show me the evidence. Then the other thing that I just want to point across, the evidence. There is no evidence that I've found, none anywhere in the world, that is about an Aboriginal parent that wanting a second-rate education for their kids. Most evidence that asks Aboriginal parents, the longitudinal studies that we've got, what they want for their children. They want a quality education where English is really important, as well as their Indigenous languages, as well as their sense of belonging and identities. So until we come back to some sort of move beyond pluralism, which old multiculturalism was arguing, we need to move to more of a super diverse sort of understandings of pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment, and how we link these intelligences and strengths to the curriculum, and having our Anglophone teachers feeling confident to do that.
Yeah, my question wasn't based on any sort of acceptance that the cross-curriculum priority does or doesn't work. I wanted to ask people in the schools whether, their views on that, and what they thought, whether or not it's structurally. The question for me, I guess, initially is whether, if it's not working now, it may not be working now because no one's done any R&D and curriculum development for teacher preparation, pre and in service, to deal with this kind of a structure, let alone, the fact that this particular priority that is an add-on, but it is also something that is not grown out of the culture of 90-something% of school teachers. It's an add-on that is essentially an orientation to Indigenous life and understanding. And my question was, can this structure deliver that? And if it can't, that's one question. That's, I guess, your point, Lester, and there's no evidence that it can. My question then gets to be, what kind of developments around the preparation and support for teachers who Indigenous and non-Indigenous teachers who are committed to the education of Aboriginal kids, what kind of R&D, what kind of mechanisms for getting this knowledge, these understandings in? Because I'll never forget a conference in the Northern Territory. The conference was closed by the Minister for Education a few years ago, a literacy conference, and basically he had just taken over the portfolio. And he said, look, you guys have got the luxury of thinking about these things and having conferences and talking about these things. I've got to deliver better literacy in the Northern Territory for Aboriginal kids, and I've got 6 months to do that. And then he talked about the kind of package he was going to buy to, put into all of the schools and all of that kind of thing. And it just seems to me, one of the things, and James talked a bit about this with the new basics, is that there's the research around education that has policy weight seems to me very impatient research at the moment. There's no sense of thinking organically about how long a change of this magnitude, a real sea change in the way we think about who's in our schools and what it's for them, and whether they have the right to be disappointed in what we've offered for 200 years, right? Whether or not that's, the solution to that probably is going to take time. And in the case of the new basics, I think, Jim, it was John Ainley who said, I need another year, don't close it yet. And within that year, almost every teacher came around. And at the end, I can remember, because I was evaluating the South Brisbane network, that everyone I interviewed said, I don't care if they dump the new basics, I'm staying with them. This is how we're going to teach from here on. They can drop it. Head office can tell us to stop it if they want to. We're not going to. So that was a real commitment. But it took the question for educational changes, well, how R&D can affect educational practice and inform it, seems to me. And issues have to be made about how long it takes to get a particular outcome of a certain, some projects you can do in 6 to 10 months, and other projects may take 2 or 3 years of very patient development. And if you don't have some continuity in terms of departmental requirements and the curricular authorities, if you're going to have something like bilingual education has been in the Northern Territory, which has been a football for 40 years, a political football, back and forth and back and forth. Train teachers, then whip it out and do it again. 3 years later, do it again. No longitudinal development, no sense for it to mature as part of what ordinary teachers can do. And that electoral cycle and the kind of vulnerability of literacy scores to be used as in electoral cycle work, that seems to me to be part of the problem. Good R&D on a topic like this would take 4 or 5 years perspective, just for starters. So you need a body of Aboriginal authority to maintain that an orientation that can stay regardless, in a sense, independently of what the interests that Jim and others have taught, and you've talked about, Lester, about how things, get bounced in terms of political whim.
Do you think this is unique to Australia? Do you think other countries like New Zealand have moved forward in much better ways? Or Italy with Reggio Emilia, stuff like that, or Canada? I mean, is this uniquely Australian, or are there lessons from other countries that could help us achieve new possibilities?
I have a brief encounter with Swedish education. I was there a few years ago and did some work with the departmental people, and they work with Sápmi people, but in the north of the country. And these problems are what we're experiencing, what we're talking about here is comparable. It's different in a number of ways that make it easier for, I think, the Kiwis as well as the Swedish, and that is that there is relative linguistic homogeneity through their Indigenous groups, whereas there isn't here so much. But the problem is the problem of short-termism in policy and curriculum development, Rob. It's endemic in this issue, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And Aboriginal peoples are embedded in their constitution of the nation state. And so public schools are expected to deliver on democratic rights of the children for all of their citizens. Aboriginal people in Australia are not in the constitution. There is no national legal recognition of Aboriginal languages as first languages or official languages of Australia. And therefore, the majority of teachers in the Anglophone system of settler Australia are non-Indigenous peoples trying to deliver an ontological, epistemological understandings of local Aboriginal groups. And so it's quite tricky where there is no treaty with Aboriginal peoples, unlike New Zealand, Canada and the United States. But one of the sort of aspects that give us hope around the globe is issues like Canada, states like Canada, New Zealand, and so on do a couple of things quite well. And firstly is that they're across the idea that it's not only about success is not only about the individual child, it's about also the community growth. And so you come back to Jim's point and Tammy and Ned's, that schooling has to grow the community as well as the individual. And I think that there's some really good signs across the globe that this is the case. The second thing that is when you go to places like Italy, who and using Reggio Emilia philosophies in the north of Italy that I worked with, and across the Pacific, that use constructivism as you know, that all children are bringing intelligences to the school. How do we capture that? What happens in Italy is that they're recognizing that that it's really, really about trying to bring a deep critical understanding of how we teach for children that bring diversity to our classrooms. So Italy now is being overrun with a lot of refugees coming out of Syria and other places trying to get into Europe. And so now teachers are being educated and trained and in dialogue with how they bring dialogue with their students and realize the sort of position of power that teaching has by not just teaching to the student who is an empty vessel, but that the student is bringing lots of rich knowledges and intelligences and strengths by which we can capture as teachers to link to the curriculum. And then lastly is I think what happens in these countries that I've seen some particularly good movement, some in Vietnam as well, is that change isn't just about the kids, it's about the system. And so we have to look at these structural changes as well as the learnification changes. And learnification, systems and culture all have to be addressed at the same time.
Mm. I think I should be drawing this to an end. I see Tammy's probably getting distracted by school business. And so understandably, I just want to thank each of you. Bob, do you want to make some last comments? I think he's still there, but I'm not sure. I guess not. Bob, there you are.
Yeah, Rob, I just wanted to summarise by saying that I'll leave today's discussion excited about the bundle of possibilities that Ned speaks about. I think one of the challenges that we face is to deal with this thing called local contextuality. How do you contextualize? And I think this is what's been happening at places like Menindee and other places where largely the enterprise of knowledge has been fundamentally shaped around the local context, whether that's language, whether it's employment, whether it's cultural affirmation. All those things are really, really critical to the way in which education has been developed and offered in a place like Menindee. And I think therein lies some of the remedies to the type of dilemmas that we're faced with, because the type of things that we've been able to advise and develop in a place like Menindee may not necessarily work in a place like Briar Road or any other place where Aboriginal students are present. So we've got to be brave and creative about what Eva Hampton talked about as being Indian education sui generis, that it exists in and of its own kind. Now do we as educators become involved in the enterprise where we're localizing that, contextualizing it, and taking the teachers along with us, taking the community along with us, sometimes in total defiance of what the system wants. I really am concerned about a shift, as I've seen it over the last 40 years in New South Wales, to now what is a corporate sort of notion of knowledge. But the more I read and study about the education system, it is fundamentally about the way in which business responds to the enterprise of knowledge. So I'm really excited about what I've heard. And I think there are a whole range of messages that we would like to, and I hope that the people that will be participating in the conference take the opportunity to explore this in much greater detail. And I don't want the system to remain that produces the type of madness that Lester described at the beginning, where 100% of all the kids in institutional care, in prisons, in jails in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal. what does that say about the type of democracy we've created? And that really worries me.
Thank you so much, everybody. As Peter said to me as we were preparing for this, and I think Peter and I have been to a number of these conferences in Australia, we hope this is the beginning of the conversation. And we hope that each year there'll be sessions like this which really challenge and lead to truly transformative change. Because we're not talking about slight change here, we're talking about major, significant, transformative change for a better Australia. So thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for making the time. And thank you, audience. Bye-bye.